Realism and liberalism are the two dominant branches of thinking about global politics today. While each has its defender, each also has its limits. This lecture will help you pinpoint the strengths and weaknesses of each, as well as help you understand each one a little bit more clearly. As we go through, we'll also consider some of the ways in which each is challenged by globalization, which will feed into our readings on international ethics and especially on cosmopolitanism. As the text is quick to note, realism really goes back a long way. My preferred starting point lies in the Peace of Westphalia, which we discussed earlier, and the thinking of Thomas Hobbes and Niccolò Machiavelli. Hobbes is best known for his dictum that international politics is a war of all against all, since there is no supreme power, or Leviathan, to rule over the international arena. Machiavelli sought to counsel the princes of Florence that they should do what is necessary to conserve their principalities, in other words, the territories they rule over, and not be too concerned with ethical niceties. Realism has incorporated these ideas and continues to do so today with obvious modifications. Hobbes' famous quotation that life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short in a state of war was in many ways a compelling argument for a realist point of view, or at least something that looked vaguely like one in the 17th century. Likewise, Machiavelli's quotation that it is safer to be feared than loved fits into this view of the world very nicely and very well. Realists believe in a statist world. They believe in the primacy of nation-states, and that they believe that nation-states make policy, set policy, carry out policy, and that transnational corporations, non-governmental organizations, the UN, really aren't that important. They focus on ideas like self-help and the national interest, which you can read about in your text. And they endorse the notion of zero-sum politics, whereby what one state wins, another must necessarily lose. More specifically, classical, structural, and neoclassical realists all have different takes on exactly why the world is this way. Ultimately, when you read through this section of the text, don't worry too much about who authored what text. That's not what I'm going to be testing you on. Focus instead on the ideas underlying classical realism, structural realism, and neoclassical realism, so that you feel comfortable distinguishing between them and you can tell these apart. In practical terms, what that means is that realism sometimes counsels inaction, even when the human costs are very high. In Rwanda during the 1994 genocide, US policymakers decided to do nothing while they learned of and came to understand the existence of the genocide of the Hutus against the minority Tutsi population. State Department documents revealed that, in fact, there was a concerted effort not to use the word genocide, since genocide finding could commit the US government to actually, quote unquote, do something. From a realist point of view, this is perfectly rational. Rwanda has not much in the way of natural resources, it has no oil, it's not strategically significant, it's landlocked. Of course, this lack of interest, this willing to not do anything, just stand there, comes at a terrible human cost with, in the case of Rwanda, 800,000 people losing their lives in the course of a few months. Liberalism, by contrast, provides us with a very different theory and a very different set of assumptions about what global politics is all about. It is designed as an alternative to realism in which the causes of conflict and violence are different, and so the remedies must be different too. Arguably, the theory goes back to Immanuel Kant's 1795 text, The Perpetual Peace, which argued that global politics ought to be evolving in three specific directions. First of all, the costs of war were now so high, so many people died, that wars could only reasonably be undertaken with the consent of citizens. Second, it would be necessary to politically coordinate relations between nation-states to engage in pacific federations between free states, in other words, some sort of federation between nation-states that would allow them to resolve at least parts of their political differences without going to war. And the third, some sort of rule of universal hospitality would be needed to deal with the human displacement caused by globalization. In other words, in the world that Kant was trying to sketch out, you couldn't just kick people out of your country because you didn't like them and because it's your country. There had to be rules allowing for hospitality towards strangers, protection towards the persecuted, and so forth, that would create a more coherent global system. Well, needless to say, things didn't quite work out the way that Kant hoped they would work out, and they certainly didn't work out the way many more recent liberals hoped they would work out too. This having been said, and despite the outbreak of major world wars in the 20th century, people have continued to try to develop sturdy, solid institutions that would allow nation states to resolve their differences well. This is a quick and useful chronology of the way that liberalism sort of sketches out the world. You have a description of Cobden and the free trade imperialists of the 19th century in your book. And of course, in the aftermath of World War II, we have the 14 points issued by President Wilson, the League of Nations, largely created by President Wilson's own design, although the US did not become part of the League of Nations, and then after World War II, the United Nations from 1945 onwards. Indeed, since the Cold War, liberals have tried to fashion an effective post-Cold War liberal order based on human rights and humanitarian intervention, which we're going to talk about later in the class. For liberals, key concepts include the idea of the democratic peace and of liberal zones of peace. Self-determination is also a key element of the process. It was part of President Wilson's 14 points, which, by the way, you have listed in Blackboard and which are good to review as a way of better understanding what this was really all about. And increasingly means that states should have less autonomy in the real world. Liberals are perfectly happy to argue that in law, states are equal and sovereign and so on and so forth. In fact, though, they are much more open to the idea that de facto sovereignty can and should be limited by human rights considerations, by the constraints of the market, and by the overall patterns and processes of globalization. Obviously, this raises a lot of questions onto itself. For example, there are liberals who argue in favor of fairly aggressive democracy promotion. That doesn't always sit well with people who defend human rights or who advocate for human rights, and who argue that actually promoting democracy too aggressively may not be so democratic. Likewise, some liberals don't worry too much about the cultural autonomy of different groups of people who are being targeted for liberal efforts at democracy promotion. For example, the idea that tribal societies might not want to live in a liberal market economy, this idea for liberals isn't that important. Whereas other folks will take those claims and those arguments much more seriously and argue for a much less aggressive form of democracy promotion, precisely to respect people's cultural autonomy. Last but not least, here's a useful overview of the different ways in which liberalism and realism understand the world, in which they understand how the world is put together. Their views of humans, the key concepts, their view of ethics, and their views of globalization all tend to be a little bit different, and you can use this as a tool through which to put together some of the most important differences between these two perspectives, and for figuring out where it is that you fit as well within these two perspectives of the world. Of course, in our next lecture, we're going to make this a little bit more complicated again by adding in a new theory, which is cosmopolitanism, as well as a few other related theories on the theme of international ethics into this mix. So keep reading, and I'll post the next lecture shortly.